Hello and welcome back to the Whistling Podcast. My name is Bob Tomquist. We return for part 2 of Whistling in Antiquity by the classic scholar A.V. van Stekelenburg. If you missed part 1, you may want to go back and listen to it to get a sense of who Bert van Stekelenburg was and what this scholarly article is all about. To recap briefly, this is an article published in the journal Antiquity from Stellenbosch University in South Africa in the year 2000. Van Stekelenburg is trying to investigate the origins of human musical whistling and is looking for references in classical literature from the Greeks and Romans. Unfortunately, there is not much to be found as far as the kind of whistling that humans do today, namely musical whistling. We did, however, find some evidence for some whistling behaviors that are recognizable today, such as semaphoric or signal whistling, and some others. Today we will be looking for other whistling behaviors such as catcalling, the wolf whistle, and the use of whistling in magic and superstition. Now, one thing that confounds our investigation is the translation problems that we encounter along the way. Last time we found that often the verb to whistle can also mean to hiss. Even the translator I use usually translates our Latin and Greek verbs in this way. Last time I looked back at a Bible verse that fascinated me as a child, Genesis 3:8, where the Lord walks in the garden only to find that his meat robots had eaten of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, a full-on theophany if you believe that kind of thing. I made a reenactment of that scenario. Adam and Eve hear a sound as the Lord approaches. Was it whistling or hissing? I have changed my presentation a bit to reflect the possibility of the Lord hissing instead of whistling.
Heard the voice of the Lord God walking in the garden in the cool of the day. And Adam and his wife hid themselves from the presence of the Lord God amongst the trees of the garden. And the Lord God called unto Adam, and said unto him, Where art thou? And he said, I heard thy voice in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, and I hid myself.
You see that changes things a bit. So let us now continue with our investigations with the help of Dr. van Stekelenburg. We begin first with the cat call. I will be reading the article and giving my uneducated commentary on it. So here we go again with Whistling in Antiquity by A.V. van Stekelenburg. The cat call. With the following usage of whistling as a nonverbal language substitute during antiquity, we are, thanks to Cicero, not dependent on conjecture and circumstantial evidence. It is the cat call. Whistling as an expression of disapprobation or contempt, still widely in use today. Though most of our information about the catcall stems from Roman sources, it is already mentioned by Plato and Demosthenes.
They said what?
Demosthenes.
As one of the professional hazards of the actors and orators of their time. Cicero mentions several incidents that took place during his lifetime. Referring to the comedian Eros, he says that he
Escaena non modo sibilis sed etiam convicio explodebatur.
Not only the hissing, but the loud noise blazed off the stage.
In a letter to Atticus of 59 BC, Cicero relates how Caesar's friend Quintus Fufius Calenus is being pursued by the people,
clamoribus et conviciis et sibilis.
Screams and insults and hissing.
Some years earlier, Cicero had made fun of the brother of Publius Claudius, Appius, by describing how this person had tried to sneak into the circus through a dark corridor, humorously nicknamed Via Appia by Cicero, but was nevertheless spotted by the people and treated to such an outburst of sudden whistling that the horses that were there took fright. How can we be sure that the noise produced by the disapproving Roman crowd was whistling and not hissing? Cicero himself has been so good as to provide a clue. In another letter to Atticus of 61 BC, he boasts of his own popularity at that time, adding that he is receiving ovations at the games, quote, without hearing a single shepherd's whistle.
Sine ulla pastoricia fistula.
Obviously, he refers here to the absence of catcalls during his appearances, and just as obviously,
Pastoricia fistula
can only be a metaphor for whistling. Had Cicero been referring to hissing, he would have used a different figure. The catcall, therefore, was already practiced in antiquity in the same form and under similar circumstances as today, to interrupt and drive away unpopular actors, speakers, and politicians. It is therefore not surprising that in England a taboo still exists on whistling in the dressing rooms of theaters. The superstition that this will provoke failure on the stage has led to drastic counteractions. The guilty whistler has to go out, turn around 3 times in a
rite de passage,
knock, and wait to be invited again. The fact that whistling in some areas, for example in the United States, can nowadays also express enthusiastic approval may be slightly confusing for first-time British performers in that country. In Greece and Rome, however, the catcall was always derogatory. The references of Cicero to the phenomenon, those mentioned above and others, all relate to actions by the people in theaters, the circus, and on the streets. There is no evidence of a
sibilatio
ever having taken place in the Senate. No doubt for the conservatives, Cicero's
boni
Good.
whistling would have been severely
infradig.
It was one of those things that was associated with ill breeding. Clemens Alexandrinus places it on the same level as spitting and wiping one's nose in public. Understandably, therefore, when Cicero mentions it in connection with senatorial politics, it is the others, the popular party, who are stooping so low as to incite, quote, even moderate people, unquote, to whistle.
Populare sistiam etiam modestos homines sibilare docuerunt.
These Democrats have already taught even gentlemen to hiss.
Well, you can see there that our translation uses hissing instead of whistling. What is there to do? I trust the scholar more than I trust the computer. As commentary, I will just say, as a musical performer, I am more afraid of dead silence than any kind of catcalling, booing, or hissing. Lack of response to music is worse than catcalling, in my opinion. Luckily, in my experience, audiences seem to be usually pretty polite. As a performer in China, the worst I have experienced is to hear someone listening to a video loudly on their phone as I end a stirring rendition of a song. I have encountered dead silence before, and it's the worst feeling in the world. When doing a podcast, I don't have to worry about hearing the catcalling and hissing that I am sure that many of you are doing as you listen. In a future episode, I hope to address the superstitions regarding whistling, and the taboo in the theater is an interesting one. As far as whistling being about as equal as other discouraged behaviors like nose-picking, farting, burping, blowing one's nose, spitting, etc., maybe there will be a time to address that topic. Whistling and class issues is a big topic, and once I do more research on this, there's sure to be an episode on this as well. In the past, whistling has been associated with the working class, and this is another interesting topic to investigate. Whistling has been called the working man's métier.
Métier.
Now we move on to a topic that is very relevant to our times when sexism is a concerning social issue. The topic is the wolf whistle, which in the future will get its own episode. This issue is related to sexism, racism, and the changing social consciousness of our time, whether you agree with it or not. As you may know, Emmett Till was allegedly killed because he wolf whistled at a white woman. In recent years, some countries like France have banned catcalling and wolf whistling in public, and this is something I am currently researching for that upcoming episode. So let's continue and listen to what Van Stekelenburg has to say about the wolf whistle in Antiquity. The wolf whistle. Finally, there is one other application of whistling for nonverbal expression which occurs in the modern world and seems to have been practiced in almost exactly the same way in antiquity. Unfortunately, the evidence for the existence of the notorious wolf whistle, communicating sexual interest mainly by males of the human species, is very scant for the Greek and Roman past. It consists of only one episode in Plautus's Mercator. Here the father Demophos says to his son Chirinus with reference to the beautiful slave girl they both secretly love, and whom the son pretends to have bought for his mother, quote, "I can't permit it. She is hardly the proper sort of person to attend your mother," unquote. Chirinus says, "Why not?" Demopho responds, "Because it would cause scandal if such a beauty were the attendant of a wife and mother. When she passes through the streets, all the men would look at her, leer, nod, and wink and whistle." What Demopho pretends to fear is that his wife will indirectly become the focus of a vulgar kind of attention through this girl. In modern sociological texts, phenomena like the wolf whistle are ranked under the heading of, quote, "breaches of civil inattention," unquote. That is, transgressions against the civilized principle that unacquainted persons respect each other's privacy to the extent of avoiding prolonged eye contact and even pretending not to be aware of each other's presence. Nowadays, one can become painfully aware of the validity of these rules in places like elevators and waiting rooms. In civilizations that differ from each other in time and or place, these rules will, of course, differ in degree and content. Nevertheless, the wolf whistle and its verbal equivalents will always rank as one of the most serious breaches wherever a degree of civil inattention is valued, because it also directs the attention of bystanders to the victim and so turns a woman into a sexual lust object. Though Demopho's wife would not be the primary object of this undignified attention, she would nevertheless find herself in an embarrassing position, the more so because of her social status. There is therefore nothing wrong with Demopho's reasoning. Did the lustful gentleman whistle or hiss? We cannot say. One could make a case for whistling in a noisy public street. On the other hand, seems to be the preferred sound in some Mediterranean countries nowadays, as several northern European girls have assured me. We can also not say whether the wolf whistle was as much of an institution as it became later in Western society. The evidence is too meager. We even have to reckon with a possibility in the Mercator episode that we are dealing with a metaphor for chatter or whisper because of the conspicuous absence of any other verb denoting talk of any sort. If the wolf whistle did exist, however, it should not surprise us that it does not occur in the love poetry of, for instance, Catullus or Ovid. Naturally, it would have been too vulgar a phenomenon to have been allowed a place in such works. Well, once again, we seem to be disappointed in not finding much evidence for any kind of whistling in antiquity. Let's move on to the next topic. Whistling in magic and superstition. This is an interesting topic, and there will be much to say about it in the future. Whistling in magic and superstition. Having dealt with musical whistling, and with the use of whistling as paralanguage, it remains for us to treat its place in magic and superstition. Columella, in his
De Re Rustica,
Agriculture.
advises the farmer not to give oxen their fodder all at once at the end of their working day, but a little at a time, and to let them drink in between. If they refuse to drink, they should be encouraged by whistling.
oportet sibilo ad lectari, quo libentius bibant.
It is necessary to whistle.
The belief that whistling stimulates drinking is probably based on the similarity that is felt to exist between the flow of sound and that of water. We are therefore dealing with a case of sympathetic magic. Its persistence till in later times can be illustrated with a quote from an English work of the 16th century. Quote, "When I lead a horse to the water, if he will not drink, what can I do but whistle him?" Unquote. The assertiveness of Columella and of the English quotation might tempt one to think that we are dealing here with a case of subtle animal psychology rather than with magic or superstition, and that the trick might actually work. I have, however, not come across any modern followers of the practice. Two obsolete Dutch proverbs betray a considerable degree of exasperation with the procedure when directed at the opposite end of the animal's physiology.
Het is vergeefs gefloten als het paard niet pissen wil.
The whistle is in vain if the horse doesn't want to piss.
And
Vergeefs men fluit en hou me stil, wanneer het paard niet pissen wil.
In vain do people whistle and keep me quiet when a horse does not want to piss.
together with blowing and hissing, whistling occurs in the superstition and magical practices of many groups and civilizations, especially in connection with spirits. One should, of course, not consider it a contradiction that on the one hand these sounds are believed to be useful in warding off demons, illnesses, and other forms of evil, while on the other hand it is believed that they attract them. Magic and superstition are famous for defying logic. A Chinese Taoist text from the Tang Dynasty, that is AD 618 to 907, states it neutrally by saying that a good whistler, quote, commands the attention of the whole world of spirits, unquote. Plotinus names blowing,
Προσπνεύσεις.
Inhalation.
and hissing or whistling
Συρριγμός ταυσίγμα φώνης.
Whistling of the voice.
as examples of sounds used in magic. In the Old Testament, there are several references connecting whistling with the places of destruction. For example, Jeremiah 19:8,
And I will make this city desolate and an hissing. Every one that passeth thereby shall be astonished and hiss because of all the plagues thereof. And I will cause them to eat the flesh of their sons. Yuck.
And here is your new word for the day, apotropaic, adjective, supposedly having the power to avert evil influences or bad luck. For example, apotropaic statues. The whistling here must be apotropaic, in this case against the demons of destruction, and therefore related to the whistling,
Συρρήτην.
which the Emperor Julian later observed as employed, together with the sign of the cross, by Christians passing pagan cult images. It is once more impossible to say whether this apotropaic practice demanded whistling or hissing. Probably either would do, taking into account that other pneumatic acts, like blowing, were also used for this purpose. In some Christian and Islamic communities, whistling used to be, and maybe still is, connected with the devil, that is, quote, the devil's music, unquote, and considered to make the mouth impure for a long period. Women especially should refrain from whistling. Aristotle also mentions whistling or hissing
Σύζυν.
for frightening off demons and spirits.
Φωνή ταυταρτάρ.
His statement that it was applied during thunderstorms is not supported by Aristophanes and Pliny, who described the appropriate sound for this purpose as
Πόπαϊσμοί.
clucking with the tongue. The latter sound fits, of course, better with the sound of thunderclaps if one thinks of imitative magic and the undefined,
Σοφενή.
quote, making a sound, unquote, that is, knock, which Aristotle mentions in addition to,
Σιτσάιν.
will refer to this.
Πόπαϊσμοί.
Very possibly, of course, several ways of coping with a thunderstorm existed in different regions or even next to each other. Other magical uses of whistling may have been in vogue in ancient times, but we have no evidence for their existence among the Greeks or Romans. Still widespread among sailing people, also in Europe, is whistling to provoke the wind. The opposite, of course, is advisable when a storm threatens, and amongst some groups of fishermen, to stay on the safe side, one never whistles at all when on board ship. The whistling here is obviously a form of imitative magic. Belief in the evocative effect of whistling on spirits in general, not only those of the wind, is widespread, despite the seeming contrast with its apotropaic use. This undoubtedly has to do with the nature of the sound of whistling. In places devoid of human life, the eerie, anonymous sound of whistling can easily be connected with demons and spirits, and whistling may be thought to lure or provoke them. In many societies, whistling is therefore not allowed in caves, in forests, and especially not at nighttime. Amongst miners in Great Britain, a taboo exists on whistling below ground. As a last use of whistling which occurs in our modern world, we might add whistling as an expression of surprise, which seems to have a rather recent origin. The end. In the first episode on whistling in Antiquity, I left out the section on whistling in the dark. I will end by including that overlooked section. There's not much there, but since it is near Halloween when I recorded this, we can hear an ancient werewolf story to haunt our dreams. It will also bring us back to our reading of the Peter F. Ostwald article, which I will go back to in the next episode when we discuss the psychology of whistling. Whistling in the dark. Some forms of nonverbal communication are universal. Smiling and crying are as innate in humankind as tail wagging and whimpering in dogs. Many others that may have been learned unwittingly nevertheless respond so strongly to physical and psychological needs and urges that they come very close to being innate. Clapping the hands before the eyes or the mouth, bowing the head in humiliation, tearing one's hair, or holding one's head in distress. Likewise, a form of sound making, like muttering, humming, singing, whistling, seems to be a natural and universal way for humans to cope with a situation of worrying loneliness. Hearing his own sound reassures a person that he is alive and intact, reference to our old friend Ostwald from 1959. Quote, whistling in the dark, unquote, is a well-known phenomenon in the Western world. By what means would a Greek or a Roman have satisfied this human need when walking lonely and frightened in a dark place? Would this situation have triggered the same psychosomatic responses today? Would he have been muttering, singing, humming, whistling maybe? We are speculating, and we will never know for sure. Petronius tricks us once more when making it seem that he can offer us a tantalizing close parallel to our familiar whistling in the dark. In the famous werewolf story, the narrator Niceros tells how he and his companion arrive at the tombs outside town in the middle of the night. While his friend goes to relieve himself, Niceros sits down singing to himself and counting the gravestones.
Sed eo ego cantabundus et stelas numero.
I sit to sing and stand in the grave.
How tempting to interpret this scene as a clever application of psychological paralanguage, which has a superstitious and frightened slave indulge in an ancient equivalent of our whistling in the dark, since cantare
to sing
represents many forms of musical expression. We would even be justified in translating it here with whistling. Unfortunately, there is no straightforward indication that Petronius had this in mind. The only way to support such an interpretation is by seeing Niceros's earlier remark that the moon was shining, quote, as if it were midday, unquote, as an effort to create suspense because of the moon's association with
Hecate,
goddess of all things spooky. There is much that is not certain in this episode. Since the text is evidently corrupt,
Se cedo ego.
I withdraw.
is a more likely reading than
Sed eo ego.
I sit.
Unctabandus.
Lingering.
slowly has even been proposed for
Cantabundus.
To sing.
but seems to have found no takers. And now the werewolf story from Petronius's Satyricon.
After they had all wished each other sound minds and good health, Trimalchio turned to Niceros. "You used to be better company at dinner," he remarked, "and I don't know why you should be dumb today, with never a word to say. If you wish to make me happy, tell about that experience you had, I beg of you." Delighted at the affability of his friend, "I hope I lose all my luck if I'm not tickled to death at the humor I see you in," Niceros replied. "All right, let's go to the limit for a good time, though I'm afraid these scholars'll laugh at me. But I'll tell my tale, and they can go as far as they like. What the hell do I care who laughs? It's better to be laughed at than laughed down." These words spake the hero, and began the following tale. It so happened that our master had gone to Capua to attend to some odds and ends of business, and I seized the opportunity and persuaded a guest of the house to accompany me as far as the 5th milestone. He was a soldier, and as brave as the very devil. We set out around cockcrow. The moon was shining as bright as midday, and came to where the tombstones are. My man stepped aside amongst them, but I sat down, singing, and commenced to count them up. When I looked around for my companion, he had stripped himself and piled his clothes by the side of the road. My heart was in my mouth, and I sat there while he pissed a ring around them and was suddenly turned into a wolf. Now, don't think I'm joking. I wouldn't lie for any amount of money, but as I was saying, he commenced to howl after he was turned into a wolf, and ran away into the forest. I didn't know where I was for a minute or two. Then I went to his clothes to pick them up, and damned if they hadn't turned to stone. Was anyone ever nearer dead from fright than me? Then I whipped out my sword and cut every shadow along the road to bits, till I came to the house of my mistress. I looked like a ghost when I walked in, and I nearly slipped my wind. The sweat was pouring down my crotch, my eyes were staring, and I could hardly be brought around. My Melissa wondered why I was out so late. "Oh, if you'd only come sooner," she said, "you could have helped us. A wolf broke into the folds and attacked the sheep, bleeding them like a butcher. But he didn't get the laugh on me, even if he did get away, for one of the slaves ran his neck through with a spear." I couldn't keep my eyes shut any longer when I heard that, and as soon as it grew light I rushed back to our Gaius's house like an innkeeper beaten out of his bill, and when I came to the place where the clothes had been turned into stone, there was nothing but a pool of blood. And, moreover, when I got home, my soldier was lying in bed like an ox, and a doctor was dressing his neck. I knew then that he was a werewolf, and after that I couldn't have eaten a crumb of bread with him. No, not if you had killed me. Others can think what they please about this, but as for me, I hope your geniuses will all get after me if I lie. Chapter the 63rd. We were all dumb with astonishment, when "I take your story for granted," said Trimalchio, and, if you'll believe me, my hair stood on end, and all the more because I know that Niceros never talks nonsense. He's always level-headed, not a bit gossipy.